If you're a Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon fan, you've definitely seen clips or promos of the new show that HBO is rolling out, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you're a diehard fan like myself, you're probably going to be a little bit hesitant to jump into another series, especially considering that Game of Thrones ended really, really bad. And if you're following the news behind House of the Dragon, you know that George R. R. Martin is having a pretty public falling out with showrunner Ryan Condal. So skepticism makes 100% sense, right? I get it. But I'm here to talk about how genuinely impressive of a job that Ira Parker is doing with this series. And considering once you watch it, you'll know that he's not relying on the grand spectacle of dragons, battles, fight scenes, and dramatic political chaos. This story is a little bit different, and I'm gonna dive into why it is. He doesn't really have a lot of those things that make Game of Thrones to fall back on. This show is completely driven by amazing screenwriting and amazing characters. So stay locked in with me for the next 10 minutes or so as I break down why this show is 100% worth your time while doing it completely spoiler free. I'm not going to get into the deep details of what's going on in the show. I'm just going to talk about how good of a job Ira Parker is really doing and why I'm honestly addicted to watching the show. Now, to understand why this series works so well as it does, the first thing we need to talk about is where and when does this story take place, and more importantly, whose story is it actually telling? For many curious about the time period this story is set, we journey to Westeros 90 years before the main events of Game of Thrones. This series follows the journey of Sir Duncan the Tall, a wandering hedge knight, and his young but mysterious squire Egg, a boy who clearly seems more important than he lets on. Now, instead of kings, queens, and dragons ripping through the Seven Kingdoms in a fight for the Iron Throne, we follow Duncan Egg living among the common folk. We see dusty roads, small villages, and tournaments, everyday survival, a side of Westeros we rarely get to experience anymore. Seeing this world from this perspective is a refreshing breather compared to the grim politics and power struggles of the highborn that usually dominate this universe. And because this story stays so close to the ground, following two people with no real power, no armies, and no titles, that entire feel of the show ends up being very different from what we're used to in Westeros. That change in perspective directly shapes the tone and pacing of this series. And that is one of the most important things to understand before going into this show. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is not trying to be like Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. There aren't any massive battles every episode. You're not going to see constant political scheming amongst the characters, and you're not really going to see any dragons dominating the main screen like House of the Dragon has. Instead, this show is going to lean more into the character-driven storytelling, the slower, thoughtful pacing, and emotional stakes over spectacle. A grounded, almost folk-like tone to the show. If Game of Thrones was about power, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is about principles. The slower pace allows moments to breathe, and that breathing room is where the show finds its identity. But a slower, more character-driven story only works if the people at the center of it feel real. And this is where A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms really starts to shine. Now, as usual, the casting has been done incredibly well. Even for the first few episodes, every character feels like they belong in this world. Dunk feels incredibly grounded and humble, someone you immediately want to root for, and that is an unusual feelings for any Game of Thrones vet. Anyone familiar with Westerosi storytelling knows not to get attached because endings are never fair and they're always sudden. But with Dunk, you honestly can't help it. Like, you want to see him prove his worth. And then on the other side of the same coin, you have Egg, who is one of the most refreshing young characters, not just in Game of Thrones lore, but in fantasy television in general. The actor does an amazing job at bringing Egg to life, and the exchanges between Dunk and Egg are genuinely hilarious. I found myself laughing out loud multiple times, And that is pretty rare for a Westeros story. Now, while Dunk and Egg are clearly the heart of the show, they do not carry it alone. The supporting cast does a lot of the heavy lifting in making this version of Westeros feel lived in and believable. From Lionel Baratheon to the Targaryens introduced early on, every performance feels natural and well considered. No casting choice feels odd or distracting. This shouldn't be surprising though. HBO has become incredibly adept at translating Westeros to the main screen. The costume design, locations, and performances all work together to make this world feel authentic without needing spectacle to sell it. Now, what's interesting is that even with these larger personalities entering the story, the show never loses sight of what actually matters, because for Dunk, the stakes aren't political, they are personal. Now you might be wondering what makes these stakes feel real. Dunk has very little to his name. Everything he has, his reputation, his future, his sense of self-worth, is riding on a tournament and every choice he makes. Because the story stays grounded, those stakes feel real. We're not watching the fate of the realm, we're watching someone try to carve out a place for himself in a world that doesn't offer second chances easily. And that focus on personal consequence over world-ending threats really defines the kind of audience this show is made for. So the big question becomes, who is this audience actually trying to click with? You'll probably love this series if you enjoyed the early seasons of Game of Thrones, if you like characters like Ned Stark, Brienne, or Jon Snow, and you appreciate slow burn storytelling with strong character work, and you want a story that feels human, moral, and intimate. This story feels less like an epic war saga and more like a medieval road story with heart. If you've ever seen A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, this story feels a lot like that with the Westeros flair. Now, at the same time, that approach isn't gonna land with everybody, and it's worth being honest about that. You might skip this if you need constant action, or you're purely watching for dragons or shock moments and you prefer the fast-paced political chaos. A Knight of Seven Kingdoms is not trying to be like that. This show isn't trying to undo the mistakes of Game of Thrones, it's trying to tell a different story while in the same universe. So once you understand what the show is and what it isn't, the final question becomes pretty simple. Is the Knight of Seven Kingdoms worth your time? Yes, if you know what you're signing up for. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is not going to be about who wins the throne. It's about what kind of person deserves respect in a absolutely broken world. If this series does stay true to its source material, this series could easily become one of the most heartfelt stories in Westeros, a absolutely refreshing take on a usually pretty brutal story, and a reminder that Martin's world works best when it is character focused first. So if you're burnt out on spectacle but you love Westeros, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms might be exactly what you're looking for. So let me know in the comments down below, are you excited for the series? Are you enjoying it so far if you're watching it? Or do you think that Game of Thrones needs to stay a brutal and grand story? Me personally, I'm really enjoying this version of Westeros. I really enjoyed this back and forth big brother vibe that you get with Dunk and Egg. And truthfully, the grand moments only feel grand if you're reminded of what's at stake. This series is doing a great job at letting us live through the lives of the common folk and seeing everything at a ground level, when oftentimes we were seeing the world of Westeros from the eyes of the highborn. So I want to say thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you like my Game of Thrones videos. I do have a couple more planned, and once the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is done, I am so down to do a complete review of the season. So if you are looking forward for that, let me know in the comments down below too. But until then, I will see you guys next time.